So I'm here at the EEA conference with Bryan Leyland, a consulting engineer and an expert in the smaller hydro schemes and probably some larger ones as well. Bryan, you've been building hydro dams for a long time and around the world. How many do you think you've been involved in?
Directly involved in about 20, I suppose, in New Zealand, where we did the detailed design of all the mechanical, electrical, and involved in feasibility studies and other things of another 20 or 30 overseas. And in some cases we worked on quite large schemes up to 2,000 megawatts.
Okay, and you have issued or given a presentation today around some of the issues or challenges people face in building smaller schemes. It's something that's particularly relevant in New Zealand at the moment, as there's several small schemes under construction, a couple on the west coast, and I know the Lions company's doing some work in this space in the central North Island as well. What are some of the issues that you find or you've found that developers run into in the early stages, the planning and the consenting stages?
Mostly they don't seem to have looked at what we learnt often the hard way in the 1980s, and so they're starting off from scratch instead of building on what we did, which is a pity.
Okay, and what are some of the specific examples there?
The importance of getting the intakes right and using the latest technology. The importance of getting the concept right and the understanding of the need to get the detailed design correct and buy the turbines that do the job best and things like that. The whole multitude of things that are not regarded as important, yet in the end they are.
And is there an issue of people perhaps trying to do things on the cheap somewhat?
Yeah, in some cases people have done on the cheap and have had serious problems. Schemes have been abandoned and not performed and taken over by somebody else to finish. Yeah, there's been some quite bad horror stories in the last 10 years or so.
And what do you recommend in the area of pen stocks, obviously one of the sort of crucial parts of a dam?
Well, in the old days you didn't have much choice but steel, and Leyland consultants developed ways of making steel pen stocks that were easy to install and lasted a long time and were properly painted. Now those lessons are still valid, but now you also have fiberglass pen stocks, which in some cases are a very good option. About the same price as steel, but they've got other advantages. And the smaller sizes, you can use high-density polyethylene, which is wonderful stuff, but only for small sizes and relatively low heads.
And what about in the turbine space? Do you recommend a particular turbine, or are there a few different options out there for the smaller hydro developers?
In the small schemes, there's a very wide range of choices for the turbine itself, whether a Francis, a Pelton or a Kaplan, and then the arrangement of it, which doesn't exist in the larger ones. And if you get it right, you can save a lot of money, and if you get it wrong, you can finish up with an unreliable scheme that is much more expensive than it should have been.
And often these smaller schemes, I suppose, are run-of-river schemes, so you do have potential for sediment issues. What do you recommend in that space?
Now, if you can use it, and it's only a matter of how high, the limitation on the higher flows, you use what's called a coanda screen, where there are some very finely spaced horizontal screen bars that sort of scrape the water off and exclude all the larger gravel and sand. Only very small stuff passes through. They're extremely good, and they've superseded everything that we did 20 years ago.
Right, and that's going to save you lots of build-up issues further down the line.
Build up, often sediment ponds, and very often serious damage to turbines.
And what about if we go back upstream a little bit in the canal space? What do you see as some of the things that people do wrong there, and what do you recommend to kind of alleviate that from the early stages?
First thing is, right at the beginning, you've got to employ geologists and geotechnical engineers to make sure that you understand what the ground's like. In New Zealand, the ground's all over the place. There's nothing consistent. And if you don't do that, you risk having your canal slide down the hill. And it's happened several times in New Zealand, and always in the end, because they didn't take enough trouble with the geotechnical stuff, they built canals that didn't take into account the risks.
I think you used an example earlier on around the FAO scheme. Can you explain perhaps what happened there?
What happened at FAO was they had a long canal made of brown ash, and because they didn't communicate with us correctly at an early stages, they shifted the intake further to the edge of an escarpment, and they sat it on top of fractured rock. They didn't seal the fractured rock properly. They didn't make sure that the embankments were properly built, and it failed.
It's interesting that even in the space that we're in now, you still see some small hydro schemes being built, and there's obviously an economic imperative around that, and people are finding that it can be done. What are the keys for getting the economics right for a small dam in New Zealand?
Make sure it generates as much as possible, and keep the price down. That's it.
And what about in terms of the sale of the electricity? What are some of the options you have there, and what would you recommend for developers?
You get hold of an outfit that acts as a reseller for you, and in our case, they sell just into the spot market, and we get spot market prices.
That's your dam that you own in Golden Bay?
Yeah, yeah. So that exposes us to a big risk. In some years our income's high, and some years it's low, but overall it gives us a higher return than the alternatives.
Right, so you'd actually recommend selling directly into the spot market through someone else?
The risk on the cash flow.
Right, and what about in terms of the amount of outside consultants you use and things like that in the development phase?
That's very difficult because there are not many experienced consultants around, and in general, if you put on a big consultant, they'll put their junior staff on it because they can't afford to put their best staff on a small scheme. So it's actually one of the most difficult things of all, is to find experienced consultants. One way you can get over it is to set up a committee of older, experienced engineers to work with you and work with a consultant to make sure that everything goes well.
And I mean, you'd have a fairly extensive knowledge of rivers and things in New Zealand. Is there potential for a great deal more small hydro here?
But for the RMA, yes. With the RMA, it gets almost impossibly difficult. All we had to do was extend our water rights, and in the end, the whole process cost us about $200,000. Just an extension of an existing water right. And virtually all the expenditure was unnecessary and didn't benefit the environment.
So what do you recommend for developers in that RMA space?
I hope you've got a local council that's sympathetic rather than hostile. That's about all. If you're on the West Coast, you've got a good local council. If you're in the Tasman district, you've got a bad one.
All right. Now you're not unknown to have a view or two on the sector here. You're often quoted in the mainstream press. I wonder if we could just put one question to you. If you could change one thing about the electricity industry in New Zealand, what would that be, and why, Bryan?
It would have to be the electricity market, because from the point of view of the consumer, it's delivered high prices, and because of the structure of the market, the price increases will continue. It's built into the structure of the market. We need to stand back and look, and a change to a market system that acts in the interests of the consumers.
Is there a particular example overseas that you'd think works well?
Yeah, it's what's called a single buyer market, which was the one that was recommended to the wholesale development group years ago, and they turned down, and it would have delivered a much better result.
Right, or a bit of food for thought for government and perhaps the Electricity Authority as well. Bryan Leyland, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.